we are supposed to be, in First Chronicles, men who know how to interpret the signs of the times to determine what Israel is supposed to do. So it's important that we're able to see when God begins to move. In this world, in life, in our own lives, it's important to know when God begins to move. And he has been moving. We've said here at Restoration for some time, from the beginning, really, that we are living in days of fulfillment. And that's been evident in the last generation as the Jewish people have been gathering back from the four corners of the earth, back into the land of promise. It's been evident as more Jewish people have come to accept Messiah Yeshua, and they've been doing it at numbers greater than, since we haven't seen these kind of numbers of Jewish people coming to faith in Messiah than since the first century. So these two facts alone should be enough to cause God's people to pay attention, to start looking for the signs of the times, and that should make an effect on what we do and how we do it. But even more than that, since the regaining of Jerusalem and there's been all this hope, there's been this effort and expectation of building this third temple in Jerusalem, to the point that they've started crafting the proper utensils, the priestly garments, and everything necessary to a functioning temple service. So all of these should cause those who interpret the signs of the times to realize that God is on the move. God is on the move. So in looking at Ezra and looking at Nehemiah, we see God's people. They've been allowed to return from exile back to the holy city of Jerusalem, with the intent, what they're going to do in this time of when God is moving. The intention is rebuilding things. They're starting, with the temple in the book of Ezra, and they start moving onto the walls when you get to the time of Nehemiah. So they were being brought home physically from exile, but there's something even more going on in their hearts. They're spiritually being brought home as well, as they have been trying to restore this true worship. And the Jewish people in our own lifetimes, they've been brought home physically, but there's also that return spiritually as well. As they might have started out in 48 and going back home being very secular or being inclined toward atheism, especially given all the experiences they've just recently gone through. But the longer they are there in the land, the more of a spiritual awakening that has been going on. There's been this restoration of true worship, and even this interest in keeping the feasts. So in Ezra chapter 3, verse 2, we see this. It says, Then Jeshua, son of Jozadak, his fellow Kohanim, Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and his associates began to build the altar of the God of Israel, in order to offer burnt offerings on it, as written in the Torah of Moses, the man of God. And they set up the altar on its fixed resting place, and despite their fear of the peoples of the land, they offered burnt offerings on it to Adonai, both the morning and the evening sacrifices. They also kept the feast of Sukkot, as it is written, and offered the prescribed number of daily burnt offerings according to the requirement for each day. After that, they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, the sacrifices for all the sacred Moedim of Adonai, as well as all the free will offerings brought to Adonai. So all the things outlined in the Torah for true worship, the people who had been gone for at least 70 years, they were trying to restore those things, trying to put them back in the right place, trying to do them correctly. So when God begins to move in this world, especially when he begins to move in his people, this is what we should expect to happen. A return to true worship as outlined in the Torah. And so that includes, according to this passage in Ezra, a recognition of his feasts, of all of the Lord's, of Adonai's appointed holy occasions, and to the best of our ability, we are to participate in those things. There were some there during all of this, during this time of coming back in Ezra's day, that actually remembered what it was like before their captivity. There were some who were born and who grew up and knew only their experience in the exile and had never seen it any other way. And we're a lot like that group. Those of us today are a lot like that group. We've never really seen the feast of the Lord or the temple service or those types of things. We've never seen that in our lifetime. So we're a lot like that second group of people. But there, in Ezra's day, there were some that were alive to remember it. In other words, there were some who grew up with these things. There were others who had never really done them before, who were doing them for really the first time. So those two groups, those who remembered and those who never saw it, they're coming together, they're worshiping together, and then together those two groups are beginning to rebuild the house of the Lord. I hope that sounds familiar. It sounds similar to today, as the Father is bringing Jew and Gentile together. The Jewish people have grown up with many of these feasts, even though they haven't seen it as it was done in the temple. They still have been keeping these feasts for all these years. And us Gentiles are coming in and saying, we've never even talked about this stuff before, but now we want to be a part of doing it. But even then, there was a difference between the two groups and how they responded during the days of Ezra. When God begins to move in his people, he begins fulfilling his promise. Don't be surprised to find that there are two kinds of hearts together at work at the same time among the people. He says in chapter 3, verse 2, he says, when the builders had laid the foundation of the temple of Adonai, the priests or Kohanim, arrayed in their vestments and with clarions, and the Levites, sons of Asaph, with cymbals, were stationed to praise Adonai as prescribed by King David of Israel. So that's as prescribed by King David of Israel, is that temple service, that order that was developed during his day, that order of service from the Lord. It says, with praise and thanksgiving they sang to Adonai, for he is good, and for his mercy upon Israel endures forever. Then all the people gave a great shout of praise to Adonai, because the foundation of the house of Adonai had been laid. But notice, here's where we start to see the two groups at work. But many of the Kohanim, the Levites, and the patriarchal leaders, older men who had seen the former house, wept loudly at the sight of the founding of this house, while many shouted for joy. People could not distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sounds of the people's weeping, for the people were shouting so loudly that the sound was heard far away. So there were those who were thrilled at finally being able to do these things, and there were others who were grieved. They were grieved because they knew it still wasn't as great, or it still wasn't as grand, or still wasn't like it used to be with the former temple. Primarily it was the newcomers who were rejoicing. It was the old-timers who were saddened by things. And so that sound of weeping and rejoicing blended in together. And it was hard to tell the difference sometimes. And that's oftentimes how it is when, in the moments of repentance and the moments of forgiveness. When you are repenting for the things that you've done wrong and you experience that forgiveness or that outpouring of grace of God, and you're crying and rejoicing at the same time. And you see that in some ways, with the practice of things today, with many Jewish people when they're making aliyah, when they're returning to Israel, they're getting off the plane, or they're getting off the bus, or whatever it is they happen to be using, and they kiss the ground, and they're rejoicing and crying at the same time. They're crying, because they've been gone so long, but they're also overjoyed because they're finally home. Many Gentiles are happy at rediscovering the Shabbat and the feast of the Lord. They're overjoyed at finding Shabbat and the Father's ways, while at the same time many of us can be sad or frustrated. So far too many, it's too easy to become angry because we're sad because we've been missing out on this whole time. But see, all of this is in fulfillment to prophecy. After all, the nations are seeing the wisdom of the Lord's ways, and they are seeing His wisdom, and they're coming to join the Jewish people. And there's weeping and rejoicing going on at the same time, even with that, because some people, the Jewish people, welcome the Gentiles coming and joining in with them and wanting to do these things and wanting to learn about the feast of the Lord and participate. But then there are others who are wary of that, who are maybe even offended at that. So there is both rejoicing and weeping, even in returning to the Father. And so we should expect, to see those types of things going on as the Lord is moving in our day. We should see that weeping and that rejoicing. We should see a restoration of true worship. And in our day, there's a lot of us that expect or anticipate, to see the foundation for the temple, true worship laid in the hearts of His people, the spiritual longing being restored even in our day. And that can be happening before the physical foundation for the temple is even laid. And we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of that. So what other kind of things should we expect to see as God begins to move in His people? What to expect when God begins to move? So as God, as He brings some of His people back to the land, some of His people back to His ways, there's an increasing knowledge and relationship of the Messiah among both. We should expect certain things to happen in the world and in the way that we respond to things, as the way the world responds to things. And one of the things that we should be very expectant of is that opposition should be expected by the powers of this world when God begins to move. This opposition is going to take various forms from various types of groups. They'll use various tactics. And interestingly, one of the first ones is the pretense of, I want to go with you. The pretense of teaming up and going along with. You see this in Ezra chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. So Ezra chapter 4 says, when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple for Adonai, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the leading patriarchs and said to them, let us build with you, for like you, we seek your God, and have been sacrificing to Him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. So they're going back a long time. This is the origin of the Samaritans, when the Assyrians brought in these peoples, when they moved the northern kingdom out, and they brought other people from different lands and moved them in. They're claiming that they've been wanting to worship God and sacrifice to the Lord, just like the Jewish people have all this time. But if that were the case, then the altar wouldn't be still smashed. The foundation for the temple wouldn't be destroyed. There are so many things about this description that don't line up with the reality of things. That's the hard part for us sometimes. This is going to be true. There are some people, who will honestly want to come and take part in what the Lord is doing and how He is moving, even among us. But we also have to realize is not everybody who comes, not everybody who steps forward in that respect really is wanting to join with the right kind of motives. It's going to take a great discernment on our part, on the part of God's people, to be able to figure out and discern the difference between those who are genuine and those who are not. Some are going to want to join under false pretenses, so they can undermine what is going on. Is God really moving them as he has been moving in us? They'll claim that they'll want to build. They'll claim that they'll want to be a part. Claim that they are seeking God just like us. Claim that they've been doing it all along. Claiming that his ways as their own. As soon as they've moved in, they've been following him all this time. That's what these people who are coming in Ezra chapter 4 were claiming. And sometimes that's going to be pretty easy to tell the difference. It's going to be obviously false and easy to recognize. Other times it's going to be not so easy. But that's the sad thing that we should expect, is that the reality is not everybody is going to really want to join and be a part of what God is doing. There are going to be some who want to bring an end to what God is doing and how he is moving, because many times, even throughout history, when God starts to move and do things, he does it in ways that the establishment didn't predict and don't control. And so they're going to want to put an end to these things. So while we must always be welcoming of everybody, we've got to also be discerning and recognizing that opposition is going to come. And that's what Zerubbabel was doing. He says, but Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the prominent patriarchs of Israel said to them, it is not for you and us to build a house for our God, but we alone will build it for Adonai, the God of Israel, just as Cyrus, king of Persia, has commanded us. But unfortunately, these false offers of friendship, these false offers of help and partnership, even if those are discerned to be false and they are recognized and rejected, that's not going to be the end of the opposition that they're going to bring. They're going to move on to other tactics. So chapter 4, verse 4 says, then the people of the land began discouraging the people of Judah and making them afraid to build. They bribed advisors in order to thwart their plans all the days of King Cyrus of Persia and until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So this is going over decades. It says, during the reign of Ahasuerus, at the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. So note what they were doing here, what they did in opposing the move of God. They were trying to join under false pretenses. Those passages talked about the discouragement that they were trying to bring in. They were trying to make them afraid to do these things. They were trying to intimidate them and stop their building. They even went to the point where they started bribing advisors and government officials. And they began making all kinds of accusations against them. So that was in verses 5 and verse 6. So none of this kind of stuff, all of these different opposition tactics, shouldn't be surprising, because nothing's really changed. Even in our day, nothing's really changed. Many things like this still go on. And if God is truly moving in our day, then we should expect to see things like this happening. Maybe not all of them, but some of them. And they may be happening in some places around the country or in neighboring countries or around the world. We may experience a couple of them, but not all of them. We may experience, but the people next to us might experience more. So one thing to notice that I haven't mentioned is that the opposition started with those who claimed that they worshiped the same God as the Israelites who had returned. And that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. Just as what was happening in the life of Yeshua, much of the opposition to the move of God is actually going to come through those who claim to know him and those who claim to love him. And that's what he was facing. He was facing and dealing with his fellow Jewish people, but God was moving in ways that they didn't anticipate, the ways that they didn't control, and they worked hard to put an end to it. But when we look at those tactics, that were listed there, when those don't work, if they don't stop the move of God, this is not the end. It escalates from here in many respects. It can become violent and aggressive, even as Nehemiah learned. So notice in these next passages from Nehemiah chapter 2, the escalation of the opposition. So in chapter 2, verse 10, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite officials heard all of this, they were very displeased that a man had come to seek the welfare of the children of Israel, Bnei Israel. But when Sanballat the Horonite, he was displeased, and then verse 19, when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. They said, "What is this you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" So again, there's this mocking, there's this ridicule that's going on. And notice this insinuation or accusation of disloyalty that is going on. Even rebellion. And at the end of chapter 3, this is at the end of chapter 3 in the way that the TLV numbers it, or the Jewish reckoning of the numbering of the verses, that mocking continues. This is Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 33 in the TLV. It says, "Now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he became very angry and was greatly enraged." So notice again the escalation of things. "And he mocked the Jews in the presence of his colleagues and the army of Samaria, saying, 'What are these feeble Jews doing, feeble or weak or powerless? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they revive the stones from the heaps of rubble that are burnt?' Then Tobiah the Ammonite, who was beside him, said, 'Well, even if a fox climbed on what they're building, it would break down their stone wall.'" So again, they were mocking their efforts and everything that they were trying to do. And we hear some of those things today, in coming in this direction. Why would you want to do all that stuff? Why would you want to go back to keeping the Passover or things like that? Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to? Are you trying to be Jewish? I mean, are you still willing to eat hamburgers? Right? Just all the different types of things that are mocking that can be out there. And so chapter 4, when you get to chapter 4 of Nehemiah, the ridicule continues. And then it wasn't just displeasure anymore. It wasn't just ridicule anymore. It turns into anger and violence. So now when Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabians, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that restoration of the walls of Jerusalem was proceeding, so their threats, their intimidation, their ridicule, none of that was stopping what was going on. It was proceeding, and that the breaches had begun to be closed. They became extremely angry, and they all conspired together to come up and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. So again, now they're extremely angry. Now they're willing to fight against Jerusalem. Now they're stirring up this kind of trouble. And so then in verse 5 it says, "Our adversaries also said, 'They will not know or perceive anything until we come among them and kill them and put an end to the work.'" So they're wanting to continue to sneak up on them and take them out. But notice the goal. They're wanting the work. They're wanting the move of God to stop. And that is always the goal of the enemy. He wants to stop the move of God in his people. So when God begins to move in this world, when he begins to move in his people, for the goal of his purposes, the enemy's going to try to stand in the way and block it. He's going to do whatever it takes to stop things. So they accuse them of rebellion, or in today's terms, of insurrection, all with the goal of intimidating, stopping, silencing whatever it is that God has you to say, whatever he has called you to do. They're going to try to put a stop to it. But notice these accusations, these other accusations. They even took their accusations to the government officials of the day, and they went against the people of God in letters that were sent back to denounce the Israelites, to denounce what God had allowed or what he was moving. But notice even the claims of self-righteousness and loyalty on the part of these that were claiming all of this. Ezra chapter 4 verse 12, they're writing this letter. Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are completing the walls, they're repairing the foundations. Furthermore, let it be known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, no more tribute, taxes, or duty will be paid, and the royal revenue will suffer. Oh, they care so much about the king's revenue and taxes and his income. But they're trying to say that, hey, king, your pocketbook's going to get hit. He said, now since we eat the salt of the palace, and it is not proper for us to see the king dishonored, we are sending this message to inform the king. Oh, they are so loyal. They are so friendly, and they love the king so much they would hate to see anything bad happen for him like that. Aren't they nice? But see, just notice that whenever the Jewish people in the day of Ezra and Nehemiah, notice that whenever you or I are moving to fulfill God's purposes, whenever we're changing our lives to greater obedience to him and his ways, whenever God is moving in this world, and especially among his people, again, opposition is going to rise up to try to interfere with all of that. And it's not always from the world out there that the opposition comes. Sometimes it's going to come even from within the body of Messiah, from those who claim to know him, claim to love and serve him, from those who say they're doing great miracles and other types of service in his name, from those, he says, and even from some of those people who he says, depart from me, I never knew you, you workers of lawlessness, or you workers of toillessness. So we should expect that not everything is going to go smoothly as God is moving among his people. And many of you have felt that. Many of you have experienced that with broken relationships or stresses or attacks and different things that try to get in the way of you following him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So again, how should we respond when this kind of opposition comes our way? What should we do when the move of God gets pushed back? So if we discern that God truly is moving, if we discern the times and we know what Israel should be doing, then we need to take some of the appropriate steps. We should understand that this opposition is here. This is what its tactics are taking. This is how we need to respond to it. And one of the first things that happens in the life of Ezra and Nehemiah, or particularly in Nehemiah, is we need to assess our situation and the work that needs to be done, the things that are needing our attention. So look over in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 11. It says, I came to Jerusalem, and after I was there for 3 days, I got up during the night along with a few men. So they weren't necessarily making a big scene about things. But I did not tell anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no animals with me except the animal I was riding. And by night I went out by the valley gate toward Jackal Spring and the Dung Gate, inspecting the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, where there was not enough room for my animal to pass with me. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and returned to the valley gate. So he moved to the fountain gate, and there was supposed to be a way in at that point, but they couldn't. It was so badly managed or cared for, it had been broken down so much that you couldn't go in that way at all. So they turn around, or they go in a different direction. They go up by the valley by night, examining the wall. He turns back and returned to the valley gate. And so he's making an inspection here of things. To do the will of God, in order for us to be aware of how God is moving and what our part in it should be, we have to know what needs to be done. And when it comes to the kingdom of God, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But as Yeshua talks about at one point, he says there's not a lot of workers that are out there to do it. The fields may be ready for harvest, but the workers are few. And so the Israelites were really the only ones with the heart, with the real interest to rebuild the temple, to rebuild Jerusalem at all. The inhabitants of the land, despite what they said when they were claiming and coming to say, hey, can we join you? They didn't really know about Jerusalem. They didn't really care about Jerusalem. They had all that time that Israel was in exile, where they could have been rebuilding things. They could have rebuilt the altar. They could have restored the worship. They could have rebuilt the walls. They had all that time in the world to rebuild the city, to restore that true worship, to even try to figure out the feast days, to rebuild the temple, to fortify the walls, but they didn't do any of that. They didn't really want to. They were content to let the house of the Lord sit in ruins and for the city to be undefended. So it's not until the Jewish people return after the exile that they show up, that these other people who had been there this whole time even start pretending to care. But Nehemiah, he did care. He needed a correct assessment of the situation. And so he starts going around the walls. He starts doing it at night to avoid attracting this unwanted attention. And then we get to the point where it talks about his assessment of what happened. Chapter 2, verse 17, Then I said to them, you see the bad situation we are in. Jerusalem, it's desolate, and its gates have been burnt. Now come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, so that we will no longer be a disgrace. And then I told them how the good hand of my God was on me, and the words that the king had said to me. And then they replied, let us begin rebuilding. And so they prepared themselves for this good work. I mean, that's a great moment with the Jewish people that were there. There was this accurate inspection. He had come with the authority of the king, but Nehemiah was able to lay out this very straightforward goal, a very easily seen and tangible type of goal that got the people excited, and they were ready to get to work. And so they prepared themselves for this good work. They had to do preparation, in terms of cleansing, of holiness, but just in terms of the task ahead. But so it wasn't an easy task, and they knew it wasn't. But so they got prepared for it. And what's really interesting here, is each family, each tribe, you could say each type of congregation essentially started getting to work on their particular piece in the project. Each individual or group had to use their gifts, their knowledge to accomplish not the whole task, but part of the task. It was never just one man or one woman who had to do everything, never just one family. It took all of them coming together and faithfully doing their part. We see that in Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 1. Then Eliashib, the Kohen Gadol, and his brothers, the Kohanim, arose and built the sheep gate. The men of Jericho built next to it, and Zakur, the son of Imri, built next to them. The sons of Hasanah built the fish gate. Okay, this kind of sectioning of the work goes on for the rest of chapter 3 in Nehemiah. And one thing that really tells us is that in order for us really to accomplish our tasks in the service to the Father and to what God is doing, we must all be doing our part and using our gifts and our skills to accomplish His will. We don't have to do everything. One person or one group is not going to do everything. But with what is laid out before us, we need to be faithfully doing that particular task. And so as they are doing that, as they're building these different sections, working together, coming together, slowly building up the wall, they're facing this kind of opposition. They're hearing this kind of mocking and ridicule and accusation. And so the Israelites not only assessed what needed to be done as far as the work, that was an important step for them to, in the face of the opposition, they needed to know what they needed to do. But they also went to the Father in prayer. Again, that's vital for things. They were praying in chapter 3, verse 36, "Hear our God, for we are despised. Turn their insult back on their own head. Give them up as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover their guilt or blot out their sin from before you, for they have provoked you to anger before the builders." And so we rebuilt the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half of its height, for the people had a heart to work. So they sought God's protection, and they were seeking this reversal of the situation, reversal of all of the opposition of the enemy. And of course, going to Him in prayer and seeking His favor, seeking His help, His strength, His power. That is the most important step of things. And if He is moving, if He is working in this world, if He's working in His people, then He is going to hear our prayer. He is going to move to empower and protect His people so that they can accomplish the work that He has for them, the task that He has for them. And so they were working and they were seeking to complete the work. In Ezra, they were working on the foundation of the temple. In Nehemiah, they were working on the walls surrounding Jerusalem. And even when those times when that opposition, clearly wasn't working, and they were moving ahead with the project, the opposition escalated things from, again, being just angry or intimidating to becoming violent. And here they are crying out to the Lord. They believed that He would intervene. They believed that He would protect them. But that also never stopped them from thinking smartly about the situation, working to protect themselves as God had provided for them to. It wasn't, we prayed to God and we asked Him to protect us, and so we just kind of wait for Him to do that. No, they participated alongside of that. The Israelites were willing to defend themselves as it proved necessary. You see that in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 7. It says, "So I stationed people in the lower places behind the wall in the exposed places. And I stationed the people by families with their swords, spears, and bows. And when I looked things over, I rose up and said to the nobles, the rulers, and the rest of the people, 'Do not be afraid of them. Remember the great and awesome Lord, and fight on behalf of your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes.'" Continues in verse 9. "Now when our enemies heard that their plan was known to us, and that God had frustrated it, so God was intervening, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. And from that day on, half of my men were doing the work, while half of them took hold of the spears, shields, bows, and breastplates, and the leaders were behind the entire house of Judah. It goes on in verse 11. Those building the wall and those bearing heavy burdens kept one hand on the work and the other holding a weapon. And so each of the builders had his sword strapped to his side while they were building, and the shofar blower was beside me. And so we continued the work with half the men holding spears from dawn until the stars came out. Also at that time I said to the people, let every man and his helper lodge inside Jerusalem, so they can be guards for us by night and workers by day. So I hope that should show pretty clearly that even as they knew what work needed to be done, even as they were calling out and crying out to the Lord for his protection and defense, they understood that it's not a contradiction to defend themselves. They defended themselves sometimes, even on paper, when they were writing letters to the government to defend themselves against the accusations. And sometimes it was physical attack that they were protecting themselves from. We're going to face both of those things. There's going to be all kinds of things written about us or said about us and passed around that we might have opportunity to say something about and return and clear the air or proclaim the truth. But there are also going to be some that do things and attack physically. So they were enduring those ridicules, the lies, the opposition, and they were continuing the work. And they are facing the physical attack and all of those different things, but they were finishing the work and building at the same time, defending each other. And they eventually were able to finish the temple and the walls around Jerusalem. They were seeking out the ancient paths, and they sought to please God rather than men, rather than to carry favor with these that were opposing them. And as we looked at this passage before, Jeremiah chapter 6, what they were doing essentially was what happens here. So thus says Adonai, they were standing in the roads and looking. They were asking for the ancient paths, where the good way is. And then the Israelites began to walk in it. And they were in doing that, they would find rest for your souls. And that's no different for us today. We have been far removed from that life and that way of life and that activity and that practice. And it is very different for us, even though we may have been practicing and doing some things here for years. But we are still, in many ways, and our fellow believers in Messiah who haven't heard this stuff yet, they need to know that with all of this turmoil and all of this uncertainty going on in this world, and they're trying to find a footing, they're trying to find a place of stability, this is where we need to go to. We need to stand in the roads and look for those ancient paths and walk in those things, because that's where our rest is going to be. That's the kind of people we need to be in our day, ones that realize that opposition is coming, but also trying to clearly assess the task that God has for us, and to pray and seek Him and seek His provision and His protection and all these things. Realizing that the opposition is coming, and be willing to stand up for ourselves a little bit when that time comes. That's who we need to be in our day, as we are seeing God move more and more in His people, and more in this world. Things are happening, and that doesn't have to scare us, that doesn't have to intimidate us, that doesn't have to upset us. We should be excited to be a part of what God is doing. And if we are watching for that, if we are looking for that, so we can be ready to answer his call, whatever it is he has us to do, we need to be the kind of people that will even be willing to drop everything and do it. We are seeing God move among his people. And we are seeing things happening on the world stage out there. It's hard to watch the news these days without it. But things are happening. And there are things that may feel like they're too big for us. Things which we may see the opposition easier than we can see the task. It may even be from the government. It may be from other religious people. But we've all got to still be willing to face down those moments and stand up or to build our section of the wall and overcome that opposition through prayer, through the covering by the blood of the Lamb. That's what we need to be about in these days ahead. Realize that we're going to face opposition, but that we still have a very important task to be a part of, and we can come alongside one another to fulfill it. That's when we can complete our mission. That's when we'll hear things like, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." And I hope that should be something that you want to hear. I hope that's what we need to be a part of in our day. We need to hear and be faithfully doing what he has called us to do. That's the three things that I've always talked about in terms of the second coming of the Lord. We, his people, we've got to be watchful for his return, expectant of things. But we've also got to be watchful, hopeful. It's not something that should fill us with dread, but it's something that we should be looking forward to. We've got to hope and trust that he is going to accomplish his purposes. He is going to bring us the victory. And no matter what it may seem like happening at the moment, that he is still very much going to provide the victory for those who call upon his name. And so we are watchful, we are hopeful, and then thirdly, we are faithful. We must be faithfully doing what he has called us to do until he says otherwise. Whatever the task may be, we must be faithfully doing what he has called us to do. And so, with that, we just understand that he is good, his love endures forever, and if he is truly moving in our day and in our time, then let us truly rejoice in that truth. And let us be about doing what he has called us to do. Let us expect that opposition and stand together to face it and overcome it.